Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with something that might surprise you right away. We think of breakfast as the most important meal of the day, but in the Middle Ages, it wasn't really a thing for most people. You wake up in a medieval village in the year 1325. The sun is just climbing over the fields, and you might expect to smell fresh bread or bacon like we do today. Instead, you smell smoke from the fireplace, maybe some damp straw, and the faint sourness of yesterday's stew pot. Breakfast, as you know it, simply doesn't exist. For a lot of medieval people, eating right after waking up was unusual, and in some circles, it was even frowned upon. Why? Let's step back. The medieval world was heavily influenced by the church, and gluttony, eating too much or too eagerly, was considered a sin. Eating first thing in the morning made you look greedy, impatient, or indulgent. In fact, some medical writers of the time argued that breakfast upset your bodily humors, the four forces they believed controlled health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you ate too soon, you could heat the blood too quickly or disturb digestion. In other words, if you grabbed food right away in the morning, people might think you were physically unbalanced and morally weak at the same time. Most peasants simply didn't have the luxury of a morning spread, anyway. Work came first. Imagine yourself on a medieval farm. You rise at dawn, pull on your rough wool tunic, and head out to tend to animals or begin plowing. You probably haven't eaten anything yet. Maybe, if you're lucky, you had a bit of ale to sip before leaving the house. That's right, ale, not coffee. A thin, weak beer was the morning drink of choice for millions, including kids. It was safer than water, which often carried diseases, and it gave just enough calories to keep you going until the main meal, usually around midday. This ale wasn't strong, think of it more like a lightly fermented grain tea. Still, it's odd to picture a 6-year-old drinking it before heading to help in the fields. For nobles and the wealthy, things were a little different but not too far off. Some lords or ladies might break their fast early with a piece of bread dipped in wine, or a nibble of cheese, but even for them, breakfast was rarely an elaborate event. It was more like a snack, not a meal. The real feast came later, in the form of dinner around 10 a.m. or noon, which to us sounds early for lunch but was their main sitting of the day. Breakfast, if it happened at all, was just a placeholder until then. One weird thing about this habit is how it carried a moral judgment. Skipping breakfast wasn't just about saving food, it was about discipline. In many texts from the period, breakfast was associated with children, the elderly, the sick, or manual laborers who needed the energy. If you were healthy and strong, you were expected to hold out. Eating early was seen as childish or indulgent. Imagine someone in the village seeing you nibble bread at sunrise. They might whisper, "He must be weak, like an old man," or, "She's greedy, she can't even wait until dinner." Food was never just food, it carried layers of meaning. Of course, practicality played a role too. Medieval households didn't have our convenience of stoves, toasters, or kettles. Preparing a meal meant lighting a fire, grinding grain, kneading dough, or boiling water, all of which took time. It wasn't efficient to do that first thing in the morning, especially when fuel like wood was scarce and expensive. So, instead of cooking fresh, families often relied on leftovers. If you did eat breakfast, it might be cold bread, some leftover pottage from the night before, or a chunk of cheese hardened on the shelf. Think of it less like a fresh omelette and more like grabbing last night's stew straight from the pot. Let's not forget that medieval people were burning thousands of calories a day through physical labor. You'd think they would want to eat first thing to power up, but instead, the culture insisted they push through those hungry hours. There's even evidence of workers being paid partially in ale, which doubled as breakfast fuel. So, you're building a stone wall, stomach growling, and the best you've got is a jug of weak beer to tide you over. There were exceptions. In monasteries, for example, routines varied. Monks lived by strict schedules that included long hours of prayer, manual labor, and study. Some orders permitted a small morning bite, often bread or porridge, especially during Lent or fast days when main meals were restricted. But even then, it wasn't the same as our idea of a family breakfast. It was functional and minimal, not something to savor. Interestingly, medieval doctors sometimes recommended a light morning meal for people with certain ailments. If you were sick, if your digestion was weak, or if you had coldy humors, a little food in the morning was considered medicinal. That might be a hunk of bread, a spoon of honey, or a soft-boiled egg if available. So while healthy villagers were scolded for eating early, sick people were advised to do it for recovery. That shows you just how moralized food was. What counted as medicine for one person could be considered gluttony for another. There's also the question of class. A nobleman might get away with breaking his fast without too much judgment, because wealth excused indulgence. If you had servants to prepare food and piles of grain in storage, no one could really criticize you. But for a peasant, eating early might look suspicious. Was he eating more than his share? Was she wasting food the family needed to stretch through winter? Social pressure kept the poor in line, while the rich could bend the rules. One of the more unusual habits linked to medieval mornings was the reliance on liquid calories. Ale, wine, or even watered-down cider functioned almost like a substitute for food. In places near the sea, salted fish could appear in the morning meal, but it was still rare. Grains dominated the diet, and grains took time to prepare. You couldn't just roll out of bed and whip up pancakes. Milling flour was a communal job done at the village mill, and bread baking often happened in batches at a shared oven. So the logistics of breakfast just weren't practical for most households. Another thing to consider is that the concept of 3 meals a day didn't really solidify until much later. In the medieval world, most people ate twice, a main meal around midday and a lighter one in the evening. Breakfast was the odd, in-between habit. If you ate it, you stood out. If you didn't, you fit the cultural norm. It's almost the reverse of today, where skipping breakfast is seen as unhealthy, and eating it is considered virtuous. Now, let's imagine what this looked like in a castle. The lord of the manor wakes, puts on his fine linen shirt, and perhaps takes a slice of bread dipped in wine or some spiced broth prepared by his cook. That's it. No pancakes, no sausages, no fried eggs. The servants, meanwhile, might just sip ale before heading out to muck stalls or prepare the great hall for dinner. The contrast between what we expect, full plates and hearty spreads, and what actually happened, tiny nibbles, or nothing at all, is pretty striking. When you read medieval records, you find occasional mentions of breakfast at fairs or festivals. Travelers might stop at taverns and eat something in the morning, especially if they had a long journey. Street vendors sometimes sold hot pies, pancakes, or fried fish to early risers. But again, this was the exception, not the rule. Breakfast as a cheerful, everyday routine simply wasn't part of the culture. So, what does this tell us about weird medieval food habits? It shows us that food was tied up with morality, practicality, and social status. Skipping breakfast wasn't just about hunger, it was about identity. It told people who you were, disciplined or weak, rich or poor, sick or healthy. In that way, even the absence of a meal carried meaning. And while we might think it's odd to start the day with nothing but ale, for medieval people, it was normal. They would probably think our piles of cereal, bacon, and coffee are excessive, maybe even wasteful. If you ever find yourself dropped into a medieval village, don't ask what's for breakfast. You'll just get strange looks, maybe a cup of thin ale, and a suggestion to wait until dinner. And if you insist on eating early, people might think you're greedy, sickly, or worse, sinful. That's how deep the food culture ran. To us, it seems weird. To them, it was just the way things were. Tonight, as we keep wandering through the strange world of medieval food habits, we need to talk about what people actually drank. You might imagine a jug of clean water poured fresh from a well, or maybe milk from a cow, or even fruit juice. But if you were living in a medieval town, that's not what you were reaching for. The everyday drink of choice, for peasants and lords alike, was ale. Weak beer. Brewed grain, water, and yeast, sometimes flavored with herbs, sometimes not. It was more than a beverage. It was nutrition, hydration, and, in some cases, even a form of currency. And the most surprising part? Even the children drank it. Let's start with the big question, why not water? The truth is, medieval water wasn't always deadly, but it was unreliable. In rural areas, people could draw water from rivers, springs, or wells, and sometimes it was fine. But in towns and villages with poor sanitation, the water supply could be contaminated by human waste, animal droppings, or rotting garbage. Remember, this is a world without modern plumbing, sewers, or water treatment. Waste often ended up in ditches or streams that ran right past houses. Imagine filling your bucket from a river where people washed their clothes, dumped chamber pots, and let animals wade. That's not exactly refreshing. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled during the brewing process. Boiling killed off a lot of harmful bacteria, even if medieval people didn't understand germs in the modern sense. They just knew that ale made you feel better, while untreated water sometimes made you sick. So, ale became the safer choice. It wasn't just safer, it also provided calories. In a world where food supply was inconsistent, that mattered. A mug of ale gave you a bit of energy to get through chores, much more than plain water would. But don't picture medieval people stumbling around drunk all the time. The ale most people drank daily was small beer, a very weak brew with just 1 or 2% alcohol content, sometimes even less. It was more like liquid bread than a modern pint of strong lager. You could drink it all day and not be incapacitated. In fact, children drank it routinely, sometimes before heading off to school or work in the fields. Imagine a 10-year-old sipping beer at breakfast. That's perfectly normal in medieval Europe. Brewing ale was usually a household job. In many villages, women handled the brewing, which made ale production part of the rhythm of domestic life. The wife or mother of the family brewed weekly, using malted barley, oats, or wheat if they had it. The process was simple but labor-intensive: soak the grains, boil the mash, strain it, add yeast, and let it ferment. The result was cloudy, thick, and filling. Not glamorous, not refined, but reliable. Some families brewed enough to drink themselves and sell the extra to neighbors. These women were called alewives, and their trade was common enough to show up in medieval records and even in morality tales that warned against dishonest ale selling. Sometimes alewives were accused of watering down their product or cheating on measurements, but that just shows how important ale was. It mattered enough to spark disputes and regulations. Ale wasn't only for peasants. Nobles drank it too, but they also had access to imported wines from France, Italy, or Spain. Wine was considered more prestigious, especially in southern Europe, but it was expensive in the north. For an English farmer or a German craftsman, ale was far more practical. Even kings drank ale at times, though often a stronger, spiced version, and usually alongside wine at their feasts. In fact, household accounts from royal courts show massive amounts of ale being purchased, barrels upon barrels to serve the entire castle staff. Everybody, from the lowest servant to the lord himself, expected it. There were different strengths of ale. The first run of brewed grains made a stronger batch, sometimes kept for adults or special occasions. A second or third soaking of the same grains produced weaker batches. This was the small beer, the everyday drink. Brewing was an efficient way to stretch resources. Nothing was wasted. Even the leftover grain mash could feed animals or go into bread. We also need to talk about taste. Medieval ale wasn't like modern beer, which uses hops for bitterness and preservation. In much of the early Middle Ages, ale wasn't hopped at all. Instead, brewers flavored it with groot, a mix of herbs like yarrow, mugwort, or bog myrtle. This gave it a very different flavor profile, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, depending on the herbs used. Hops became more common later, especially in Germany and the Low Countries, but at first, Groot was the standard. That meant ale might taste different from village to village, depending on what herbs grew nearby. It wasn't standardized, but it was local and familiar. Because ale was so central, it shows up in a lot of cultural references. Workers were often paid partly in ale rations. A construction laborer might get bread, a bit of cheese, and several quarts of ale as part of his daily wage. Monks brewed ale in monasteries, producing enough not only for themselves but also for travelers, pilgrims, and charity. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing skill, and in some ways, they were the first large-scale commercial breweries. When medieval people gathered at fairs or markets, alehouses and taverns were everywhere, selling cups of the stuff to keep people fueled. Drinking ale was less about partying and more about survival. That said, ale could also be abused. Stronger brews did exist, and taverns had reputations as rowdy places. Alehouse brawls are mentioned in court records, and preachers often scolded people for spending too much time and money drinking. But the daily, weak ale wasn't about getting drunk. It was about having something dependable to drink when clean water was questionable. Think of it as medieval Gatorade, hydrating, calorie-providing, and ever-present. Children's ale drinking might sound shocking to us, but remember, the alcohol level was low. A small beer had less alcohol than many modern sodas have caffeine. It was filling, safer than water, and part of the culture. It's only in hindsight, knowing what we know about alcohol's effects, that it seems strange. For medieval families, it was just practical. Ale also marked social spaces. Taverns were important centers of village life, where people met, shared news, and sealed deals. Sometimes the line between a household brewer and a tavern keeper was blurry. Anyone with a surplus could set up shop. That made ale not just a drink but also an economy. In some towns, authorities regulated prices to prevent cheating or shortages. Taxes were sometimes collected on ale sales, making it a significant revenue source for local governments. We shouldn't forget that not everyone liked ale. Some church writers worried that it encouraged laziness or indulgence. Physicians sometimes warned that ale made with certain herbs could overheat the body or disturb the humors. Yet, despite these criticisms, no alternative ever really replaced it. Water was too risky, milk spoiled quickly, and fruit juices were seasonal and rare. Ale endured as the everyday solution. If you picture medieval daily life, you need to picture mugs of ale on the table, not pitchers of water. Families drank it at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Travelers carried it in leather flasks. Workers stopped for an ale break. Monks brewed it in cloisters. Nobles served it at banquets. And children drank it at school. That was the rhythm of hydration in the Middle Ages. In a way, ale connected everyone. Rich and poor, young and old, male and female, all drank it. The type and quality varied, but the habit was universal. It's one of those weird medieval food customs that seemed strange to us but was second nature to them. If you were suddenly dropped into a medieval village and asked for a glass of water, people might laugh. Why would you want that, they'd ask, when we have perfectly good ale? So next time you think about medieval meals, don't just imagine bread, meat, or pottage. Picture the constant presence of ale, cloudy and warm, poured into wooden cups or earthenware jugs. It wasn't a luxury. It wasn't a treat. It was the backbone of daily survival. And if you refused to drink it, people might think you were odd, reckless, or even suspicious. After all, who in their right mind would risk the water? So now that we've set the stage with the absence of breakfast and the ever-present mugs of ale, let's talk about something even stranger to modern eyes. Bread wasn't just food in the Middle Ages. It was also your plate. Instead of porcelain, ceramic, or even wood in many cases, medieval people used something called a trencher. A trencher was basically a big, thick, stale hunk of bread, cut into a flat slice, sometimes several days old, and it doubled as a dish. You'd pile your meat, stew, or vegetables on top, let it soak in all the juices and fat, and then either eat it at the end or toss it aside. The idea of your dinner plate being edible is both practical and odd, and it tells us a lot about how medieval people thought about food and waste. Let's picture this. You're sitting in the great hall of a castle, maybe during a feast day. Long wooden tables stretch across the room, lit by torches and candles. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine hangs in the smoky air. Servants bring out platters of roasted pork or venison, pies filled with fish, or bowls of pottage. Instead of placing these dishes in front of you on a ceramic plate, they hand you a trencher, a square of hard bread. It's not soft, fluffy bread like we imagine today. This is coarse, dense, often made of rye or barley, and baked in large loaves that could last for days. By the time it's used as a trencher, it's already stale. But that's the point. Stale bread was sturdy, less crumbly, and capable of holding food without falling apart immediately. The use of trenchers was practical in a society where wood, pottery, or metal tableware was expensive. Bread, on the other hand, was already being baked daily in massive quantities. Why not press it into double duty? Not only did trenchers save on washing up, because, after all, soap and hot water weren't cheap luxuries, they also ensured nothing went to waste. A trencher soaked in meat juices and gravy became a rich, savory treat by the end of the meal. If you were hungry, you ate it. If you were a guest of high status, maybe you didn't. Sometimes the trencher was collected afterward and given to servants, the poor, or even dogs. Either way, nothing was truly wasted. Trenchers weren't just random chunks of bread thrown on the table. Over time, they developed a kind of etiquette. In the earlier Middle Ages, they were large, round loaves cut in half and hollowed slightly to form a bowl shape. Later, they became more standardized squares of bread cut specifically for this purpose. By the 14th and 15th centuries, wealthier households even developed wooden or pewter trenchers, but the bread versions remained common among everyone else. It's worth remembering that bread itself was central to medieval diets, more so than meat or vegetables. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was the foundation of every meal. Using it as a plate only reinforced its importance. Now, let's talk about what would go onto a trencher. If you were a peasant, it might just be pottage ladled onto the bread, the broth soaking through until you were eating with a spoon and then finishing the soggy loaf. If you were in a castle, the trencher might hold slices of roasted beef, spiced chicken, or even exotic dishes flavored with saffron or cinnamon. Sauces were a big deal in medieval cooking, and they were usually quite runny compared to our thicker modern gravies. A trencher was perfect for catching those drips. Think of it like the medieval equivalent of mashed potatoes soaking up gravy on Thanksgiving, except the mashed potatoes are your plate. The social meaning of trenchers is also fascinating. Imagine you're at a noble feast. The lord and lady eat their fill of meat, nibbling delicately, maybe ignoring their trencher. When they're done, servants take away the soaked bread and distribute it to the poor waiting at the castle gate. To those hungry people, the greasy, sauce-soaked trencher is a life-saving meal. So, in a way, the trencher became part of a system of charity. The rich could dine in luxury, and the leftovers, still valuable, could feed those with less. It's strange to think of a piece of old bread serving as both a table utensil and a social safety net. There are also records of trenchers being used in communal dining, where two people might share one between them. That says something about the intimacy of medieval eating. Meals weren't always individual, neatly portioned experiences like today. They were communal, messy, and shared. You and your neighbor might both reach into the same dish, cut slices from the same hunk of meat, and let the juices spill onto the same trencher. Table manners, as we understand them, were still evolving. Forks were rare until later centuries. Knives and hands did most of the work. Bread soaked up the rest. To us, it might seem unhygienic. To them, it was simply normal. What about the taste? Well, imagine biting into a hunk of coarse rye bread that's been soaking in lamb fat, garlic sauce, and vinegar for an hour. To a hungry medieval worker, that's delicious. It's not subtle, it's not fancy, but it's hearty. Even better, it ensured nothing went to waste. Medieval people were deeply concerned with not wasting food, partly because famine was always a risk. Harvests failed, winters were long, and grain shortages could push people to the brink. By turning bread into plates, they stretched their resources and made sure every crumb was used. Interestingly, trenchers sometimes played a role in medical thought too. Some physicians advised against eating the trencher itself if it was soaked in very fatty or spicy sauces, arguing it could upset digestion or unbalance the humors. Others recommended it as a way to absorb richness and provide energy. Again, food was never just food, it carried health, moral, and even symbolic weight. Eating the trencher might mark you as greedy in a noble hall, but refusing it in a peasant cottage might make you look wasteful. Over time, the idea of trenchers began to evolve. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, trenchers of wood, pewter, or even silver became more fashionable among the wealthy. These weren't edible, but the word trencher stuck. The bread version gradually declined as tableware became more available, but for centuries, bread plates were the norm. Imagine the shift from tearing into greasy, soggy bread at the end of dinner to delicately using a fork on a ceramic plate. That change marks the move from the rough communal style of medieval dining to the more refined practices of the early modern period. There's even an element of theatre in trenchers. At big banquets, the display of food was almost as important as the taste. Dishes were paraded out, sauces poured, colours arranged. The bread trenchers, soaking it all up, might never be eaten by the nobles, but they were part of the spectacle. Later, when given to the poor, they extended the feast beyond the hall. So the trencher wasn't just practical, it was symbolic of abundance, generosity, and hierarchy all at once. It's easy to laugh at the idea of a bread plate, but think about modern parallels. Edible taco shells, bread bowls for soup, even pancakes used as wraps, they're not so far removed. The medieval trencher was the ancestor of all those edible containers. The difference is that in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a novelty. It was necessity. If you found yourself in a medieval hall, you'd probably have to adjust your expectations. No neat plates, no clean napkins, no forks. Just a chunk of old bread, your knife, and your fingers. By the end of the meal, your trencher would be soaked through, sagging, maybe falling apart in your hands. You decide whether to eat it or hand it over. Either way, it carried the flavors of everything you'd just eaten. In that sense, it was like a culinary time capsule, holding the memory of the meal in its soggy crust. And so, bread in the Middle Ages wasn't just the staff of life. It was also the tableware. A strange, practical, and deeply symbolic habit that reminds us how resourceful people could be in a world where waste meant hunger. It's one of those weird food customs that feels almost alien to us, yet when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. After all, if you can eat the plate, nothing goes to waste. When we think of medieval food, many people picture great feasts, a long wooden hall filled with candles and torches, tables groaning under the weight of roasted pigs, venison, and poultry, servants carrying platters, and music filling the smoky air. And in many ways, that picture is accurate, at least for the wealthy. If you were a lord, a knight, or part of a noble household, your diet included an astonishing amount of meat compared to ordinary people. The sheer variety of animals that could appear on the medieval table is staggering. But this wasn't just about taste or nutrition. Eating meat was a social statement, a way of showing status, wealth, and even moral superiority. It was one of the strangest divides between the rich and the poor in the Middle Ages. Let's start with the scale of consumption. Surviving household accounts from castles and noble estates show staggering quantities of meat being bought, butchered, and cooked. We're not talking about a chicken or two. We're talking about dozens of cattle slaughtered over the course of a year, hundreds of pigs, flocks of sheep, and countless wild animals brought in from hunts. The kitchen of a major noble household might roast entire oxen at once, or prepare dozens of capons and geese for a single feast. And this wasn't occasional. Wealthy families ate meat daily, and often in amounts that would shock us today. Chroniclers sometimes remark that a nobleman could eat more meat in a week than a peasant family would see in a season. It wasn't just the quantity. It was the variety. Nobles had access to beef, pork, mutton, venison, poultry, rabbits, and more exotic animals depending on where they lived. Game was especially prized, both because it was difficult to obtain and because hunting was a privilege reserved for the upper classes. A stag brought down in the Lord's forest was not just dinner, it was a display of wealth, leisure, and power. Certain birds, like swans and peacocks, were considered delicacies and sometimes presented with their feathers reattached after cooking to impress guests. These were showpiece dishes, meant as much for display as for eating. Now, let's compare this to peasants. The average farmer might rarely taste fresh meat. Maybe a chicken at Christmas, maybe some bacon if their pig had been slaughtered in the autumn, but otherwise, meat was scarce. For them, diets were built around bread, pottage, and small amounts of cheese or vegetables. Meat was expensive, and hunting was often forbidden by law. So when a nobleman sat down to a table covered in roasted beef, capons, sausages, and venison pies, he wasn't just enjoying himself. He was reminding everyone in the hall that he had the wealth and privilege to eat what others could not. Another strange detail is the cuts of meat that were eaten. Today, many people prefer steaks, fillets, or chops. In the Middle Ages, nobles did eat prime cuts, but they also enjoyed entire roasted animals, heads, tails, offal, and all. Sausages made from blood and organs, stews made from innards, pies with a mixture of meats and spices, all of these were normal. Part of this came from a lack of refrigeration. Animals were butchered and consumed as fully as possible to avoid waste. But it also reflected a different sense of taste. Rich sauces made with vinegar, spices, and fruit often accompanied the meat, turning strong or gamey flavors into delicacies. A goose roasted with apples, or beef cooked with raisins and wine, might sound unusual to us, but to a medieval palate, it was luxurious. Seasoning and preservation were also important. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron were imported from Asia and cost a fortune. Using them in meat dishes wasn't just about flavor, it was about showing off. If your venison pie was spiced with cloves and nutmeg, everyone at the table knew you could afford to import goods from halfway around the world. Salt was another critical resource. Salting beef or pork preserved it for winter, but good quality salt wasn't cheap. The ability to store large amounts of salted meat marked a household as wealthy and secure. Poor families had to rely on smaller animals and couldn't keep meat fresh for long. Hunting added another layer of strangeness to medieval meat habits. For nobles, hunting was both sport and food supply. It required trained dogs, horses, and large tracts of land. Certain animals, like deer, boar, and hare, were considered noble game and strictly reserved for the aristocracy. Poaching by peasants was harshly punished, sometimes even by death. This meant that venison, boar, or swan wasn't just rare, it was forbidden fruit for ordinary people. When nobles ate these meats, they were consuming symbols of their exclusive rights. A venison roast wasn't just dinner, it was a declaration of power over the land and its people. At feasts, the display of meat could become almost theatrical. Records describe entire animals being roasted and served whole, a pig with an apple in its mouth, a swan presented in its feathers, a pie that released live birds when cut open. These weren't just meals. They were performances meant to awe the guests and reinforce the host's prestige. Imagine sitting at a long table, watching servants bring out a massive boar's head, dripping with sauce, garnished with herbs, and carried with ceremony. You'd know instantly that you were in the presence of wealth and authority. Meat wasn't just sustenance, it was propaganda. It's worth noting that this diet of constant meat wasn't always healthy. Medieval doctors, working under the theory of humors, sometimes warned that too much red meat could make the body hot and dry, leading to anger, lust, or illness. Nobles occasionally balanced their diets with fish or lighter foods, especially during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. But overall, meat was the default. For many nobles, a meal without it would have seemed incomplete, even unthinkable. The contrast between rich and poor diets becomes especially striking in times of famine. While peasants might be boiling acorns or stretching pottage with weeds, nobles could still feast on salted beef, venison, and imported spices. Chroniclers sometimes criticized the excesses of the wealthy, pointing out the hunger in the countryside while the lords dined on swans and peacocks. But the system persisted, reinforcing social hierarchies through food. We should also talk about how meat was carved and eaten. At a noble table, carving was a skilled job, often performed by a trained servant. There was etiquette in how to slice a roast, present it to the lord, and distribute portions to guests. Eating meat wasn't just about consumption, it was about ritual. Guests were expected to show gratitude, not grab greedily. A well-carved piece of venison or beef was a mark of refinement. By contrast, peasants simply hacked meat into stews or roasted whatever small animal they could, no ceremony required. So, what's weird about all this? To modern eyes, the sheer amount of meat consumed by the wealthy is unusual. Today, even rich people don't typically eat entire roasted swans or pies filled with live birds. The combinations of meat with sweet fruits and spices seem strange too. But the weirdest part might be the way meat became a symbol of identity. To be rich in the Middle Ages meant to eat meat every day, in abundance. To be poor meant to go without, or to taste it only rarely. Food was a visible marker of class, and meat was the clearest marker of all. If you found yourself at a medieval banquet, you might be overwhelmed by the smells, the sights, and the constant presence of roasted flesh. You might also notice how little the peasants outside the castle ever tasted of it. For them, meat was a dream. For the rich, it was daily life. And so, in the Middle Ages, meat wasn't just food. It was power, wealth, and spectacle served on a trencher of bread, dripping with spice and fat, reminding everyone at the table exactly where they stood in the social order. We've talked about bread as plates and nobles feasting on endless meat, but there's another side to medieval eating that feels just as strange: how people actually kept their food from spoiling. Remember, this was a world without refrigerators, freezers, or airtight packaging. If you killed a cow, you had to figure out how to make sure it didn't rot before you could eat it all. If you caught fish from a river, you couldn't just toss it on ice. You needed methods, old, often odd, sometimes harsh, to stretch the life of your food. Preservation wasn't just practical, it shaped the entire taste of medieval cooking. And to us, some of those methods might sound more like covering up rot than preserving freshness. Let's start with the most important technique: salting. Salt was absolutely essential in the Middle Ages. It preserved meat and fish by drawing out moisture, making it harder for bacteria to grow. But salt wasn't cheap. Good salt came from coastal regions, harvested through evaporation ponds or mined in blocks. Transporting it inland made it even more expensive. So, having access to large quantities of salt was itself a sign of wealth. Big households salted beef, pork, and fish in barrels to last through the winter. The salt could be so heavy and thick that eating the meat later required soaking and boiling it several times to wash away the excess. Imagine sitting down to a tough, overly salty hunk of beef, not because it tasted good that way, but because it was the only way it would last months without rotting. For peasants, salt was harder to come by. They might preserve small amounts of pork or bacon with whatever salt they could afford, but most often they had to consume meat quickly before it spoiled. That's why pigs were valuable. They could be slaughtered in autumn, salted, smoked, or dried, and their fat used for cooking throughout the winter. Whole villages sometimes gathered for butchering and preserving, turning it into a communal task. Nothing went to waste. The meat was salted, the fat rendered, the organs made into sausages, and the skin used for leather. Still, for the poor, preservation was often about stretching scraps, not feasting on whole barrels of salted beef. Smoking was another method. Meat or fish was hung above a fire, sometimes for days, allowing the smoke to dry it out and add flavor. This was especially common in northern Europe, where colder climates and long winters made preservation vital. A smoked fish might last weeks, a smoked ham even longer. But the taste would be strong, far smokier than anything we're used to. Eating smoked fish or bacon daily could be overwhelming, but it was better than starving. Families with chimneys often doubled the smokehouse with the home itself, food hung above, smoke filling the rafters, and the smell clinging to everything. It must have been pungent, but it worked. Pickling also had its place. Vegetables could be stored in brine or vinegar, creating sharp, sour flavors that complemented heavy, fatty meats. Cabbage, onions, cucumbers, and even fish were pickled. The acidity slowed spoilage and added variety to the diet. Monasteries in particular used pickling to stockpile food for the long fasting seasons when fresh meat was off the table. Imagine a monk in winter eating pickled herring with bread and ale. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. Then there's the strange habit of spicing. To us, spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and black pepper are about flavor. In the Middle Ages, they were also used to disguise the taste of food that was well past its prime. Spoiled meat, heavily salted fish, or oily stews could all be made more palatable with enough spice. Of course, spices were extremely expensive, imported from Asia through long trade routes, so using them also shouted wealth. Nobles sometimes mixed sweet spices with meats, beef stewed with raisins and cinnamon, chicken cooked with sugar and cloves, not just because they liked the taste, but because it masked whatever off flavors lingered after preservation. Today we'd throw spoiled food away. Medieval cooks covered it with saffron and hoped for the best. We also have drying. Grains, beans, and peas were naturally suited for long storage once dried, and they became staple foods precisely because they kept well. Fish, too, could be dried in the open air or in smokehouses. In Scandinavia, dried cod, called stockfish, became a major export. It was rock hard, needing to be soaked and pounded before cooking, but it lasted almost indefinitely. To medieval traders and sailors, this was invaluable. A ship could carry barrels of dried fish to feed crews for months. It wasn't exciting food, but it kept men alive. Another odd preservation method was burying food. In some regions, fish or cheese was buried underground to ferment. The cold, dark earth slowed spoilage, while fermentation transformed the flavor. Some of these traditions survived. Think of Icelandic crackle, shark meat fermented underground until it smells of ammonia. In the Middle Ages, similar practices existed across Europe. Strong cheeses were often aged in caves, developing intense flavors that were both loved and hated. For people accustomed to it, this was normal. For outsiders, it could be revolting. Honey also played a role. Its natural antibacterial properties made it useful for preserving fruits and even meats. Candied fruits, figs, dates, or citrus peels cooked in honey were luxury treats that could last far longer than fresh fruit. In noble courts, these were prized as desserts or gifts. Again, sugar was rare and expensive, but honey was more accessible. Villages with beekeepers could rely on it as both a sweetener and a preservative. One of the strangest side effects of these preservation methods was how they shaped daily taste. A medieval person's diet was filled with strong flavors, overly salty pork, smoky fish, sour pickles, heavily spiced stews, fermented cheeses. To them, this was just normal food. To us, it might taste like a collection of mistakes, too salty, too sour, too smoky. But when fresh food was a luxury that lasted only a day or two, these preserved options were the backbone of survival. Preservation also intersected with religion. Fasting days, which covered almost half the year in some calendars, required alternatives to meat. That meant fish became even more important. Salted and smoked fish were shipped across Europe to meet demand during Lent and other fasting periods. Some monasteries became major producers, trading barrels of preserved fish to cities and nobles. Preservation wasn't just about feeding a family, it was part of an international economy. We shouldn't forget the role of alcohol here too. Ale and wine, while not food preservation in the strict sense, were ways of storing calories in liquid form. They kept far longer than milk or juice and could sustain workers through months of hard labor. They were also safer than water, as we covered earlier. In a sense, brewing was its own form of preservation, grains and fruit transformed into drink that wouldn't spoil quickly. And of course, preservation wasn't perfect. Spoilage still happened. Medieval cookbooks include recipes for reboiling meat that had started to smell, or for adding vinegar and spices to freshen food that was turning. People accepted that some food would be slightly off by modern standards. What mattered was stretching supplies through the long gaps between harvests. The hungry gap in early spring, when stored food ran low and new crops weren't ready, was especially dangerous. Preserved foods carried people through that season. Without them, famine was far more common. The weirdness, to us, is how much people tolerated flavors and textures we'd reject instantly. Imagine eating fish that's been salted so hard it has to be soaked overnight, then boiled until soft, then smothered in garlic and onions to hide the taste. Or chewing dried stockfish that's been beaten with a hammer before it's edible. Or biting into bread that's gone sour, spread with rancid butter that's been scraped of mold. These weren't occasional accidents, they were daily realities. People adapted their palates and convinced themselves it was normal, even tasty. At the same time, these methods allowed medieval people to survive and build communities in harsh conditions. Without salt, smoke, vinegar, honey, and drying, entire populations would have starved every winter. Preservation shaped not only taste but also trade routes, economies, and power. Salt mines, spice caravans, and fish markets became the lifelines of Europe. A noble's table piled high with salted beef and spiced pies wasn't just a feast. It was proof of control over these resources. So when you think about medieval meals, don't just imagine roasted pigs and fresh bread. Picture barrels of salted meat stacked in a cellar, strings of smoked fish hanging from rafters, jars of pickled vegetables on a shelf, and wheels of cheese aging in a cave. Imagine the strong smells, the salty bites, the sour tang, the smoky aftertaste. These weird preservation methods defined the medieval diet as much as the food itself. Without them, survival wasn't possible. And with them, taste was forever altered, harsh, strange, but strangely enough, beloved. If there was one dish that truly defined medieval daily life, it wasn't roasted swan in a noble hall or salted beef in a castle cellar. It was pottage. A simple word for what was, essentially, an endless pot of stew. To the medieval mind, pottage wasn't just food. It was routine, it was survival, and it was the most adaptable dish of the entire Middle Ages. Everyone ate it, from peasants in small cottages to monks in monasteries, even to nobles who sometimes enjoyed fancier versions. It was the kind of dish that never really ended, simmering day after day, with ingredients thrown in as they came and went. For us today, it would feel strange to live on something so plain, so repetitive, and so shapeless. But for medieval people, pottage was the backbone of their diet. Let's imagine a morning in a medieval peasant household. The fire is already burning, smoky and uneven, in the center of a one-room cottage. Hanging over it is a big blackened pot. Inside is yesterday's pottage, thick and lumpy, made from barley, beans, cabbage, onions, and maybe a shred or two of bacon if the family was lucky. The pot never really gets emptied. Instead, new ingredients are added, old ones dissolve into the broth, and the stew becomes a constantly changing mix. This was known as a perpetual stew. If you visited the same cottage in March and again in June, the pot might taste completely different, but the cooking never really stopped. The base of pottage was almost always grain. Barley, oats, or sometimes wheat if available. Grains gave bulk and calories, turning thin broth into something filling. To that, people added whatever vegetables were in season: leeks, carrots, turnips, peas, beans, or kale. Herbs from the garden flavored it: parsley, sage, thyme. Meat, when available, was rarely the centerpiece. A bone for flavor, a bit of fat, or scraps from butchering went into the pot. But most of the time, it was meatless, especially for peasants. You ate pottage every day, often more than once a day. It was breakfast, dinner, and supper all rolled into one dish, just reheated and ladled into bowls. For nobles, pottage existed too, but it looked very different. Instead of barley and onions, it might be made with fine white wheat, almonds, saffron, and sugar. Cookbooks from the 14th century describe pottages that were actually rich soups or broths, thickened with breadcrumbs and flavored with exotic spices. A noble table might serve a white pottage with almond milk and capons, or a green pottage with herbs and spinach. The word pottage covered a wide range, from the humblest bean stew to the richest, spiciest concoction. The difference was what you could afford to throw in. One of the strangest things about pottage is how it blurred the line between cooking and storage. In a world without refrigeration, leaving food sitting out was dangerous. But leaving it in a pot, simmering over a fire all day, kept it edible. Families sometimes kept their stew going for weeks, even months, just topping it up as needed. Fresh carrots went in one day, dried peas the next, maybe a rabbit if one was caught, and then cabbage the week after. It was recycling before recycling was a word. Nothing was wasted because everything could go into the pot. Even stale bread was broken up and used as a thickener. The taste? Probably earthy, bland, and monotonous to us. Grain-heavy, with soft vegetables boiled until mushy, flavored by salt if you had it, or just by onions and leeks if you didn't. Occasionally you might get a bite of meat or a surprise from a new herb. But for most peasants, this was food, hot, filling, and reliable. It didn't need to be exciting. It needed to keep you alive through long days of labor. Pottage was also seasonal. In summer, fresh vegetables brightened it. In winter, dried beans and peas dominated. During Lent or fast days, no meat went into the pot. Instead, maybe fish or eggs if allowed. This flexibility made it ideal for a society where food supply was unpredictable. Whatever you had, you threw it in. If the harvest was good, the pot was hearty. If it was bad, the pot was thin, almost just watery porridge. Pottage could be both feast and famine, depending on the year. Children grew up on it. The elderly relied on it when their teeth could no longer chew hard bread or tough meat. Sick people ate thin pottage as medicine, easy to swallow and gentle on the stomach. Monks recorded pottage recipes in their dietary texts, sometimes advising against too many strong spices for fear of upsetting the humors. Physicians even recommended certain versions, like leek and barley pottage, for particular ailments. It wasn't just food, it was considered part of health management. One detail that feels strange to us today is how communal it was. In a peasant family, everyone dipped their spoon into the same pot or bowl. There was no sense of individual servings. The father might take the first ladle, the children after, everyone sharing the same stew. Hygiene as we think of it wasn't part of the equation. What mattered was stretching the food. Sometimes bread trenchers were placed under the ladle of pottage to soak it up, eaten afterward as a makeshift bowl. Again, food and tableware blurred. At feasts, pottages appeared as first courses. A noble guest might be served a rich broth thick with almonds, saffron, and tender meat. These fancied pottages were carefully spiced and sometimes colored with herbs or flowers to look appealing. They were a far cry from the grey barley and cabbage mix of the peasant cottage, but the concept was the same: grain and liquid cooked together until thick. It shows how a single dish could exist at every social level, transformed by wealth. We also have records of sweet pottages, made with milk, honey, dried fruits, and spices. These were closer to what we might call porridge or rice pudding today. Nobles enjoyed these as desserts or as lighter meals on fasting days. Again, the flexibility of the dish was its strength. It could be savory, sweet, thin, thick, rich, or plain. It was never just one thing. The endless nature of pottage also shaped people's expectations. Today, we crave variety. We want a different meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But medieval people didn't expect that. Eating the same dish every day wasn't boring, it was normal. If you had a pot of pottage simmering, you had security. Hunger was far worse than monotony. So the weirdness, to us, is not the dish itself but the mindset, the idea that one pot of stew, reheated endlessly, was enough for life. Think about the smells of a medieval village. Every cottage had a pot bubbling. The air would be thick with smoke, onions, and cabbage. Sometimes bacon fat, sometimes garlic, sometimes herbs. To us, that might seem oppressive. To them, it was home. Pottage wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It carried families through lean seasons and became the taste of survival. So why does it feel so strange to us? Maybe because we associate stew with comfort food, something warm on a cold evening. For medieval people, it wasn't comfort, it was necessity. It wasn't a treat. It was life. Eating pottage every day for decades sounds monotonous to us, but for them, it was stability. And when you've lived through famines, plagues, and failed harvests, stability is worth more than flavor. If you ever found yourself dropped into the year 1325, chances are your first meal wouldn't be roasted meat or sugared pastries. It would be a bowl of pottage, steaming, thick with barley and leeks, maybe flavored with bacon fat if you were lucky. You'd eat it with bread or a spoon, share it with others, and accept that you'd be eating the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. And after a while, you might stop finding it strange. You might even find comfort in its predictability. That was the power of pottage, the everything stew, the endless stew, the dish that never really ended, just changed with the seasons and the fortunes of those who cooked it. One of the strangest parts of medieval eating habits wasn't what people ate, but when they ate. The medieval calendar was heavily influenced by the church, and that meant food wasn't just about hunger or taste. It was about rules, discipline, and showing devotion. The church dictated when meat could be eaten, when it couldn't, and what counted as meat in the first place. These rules created an entire culture of fasting and feasting that feels strange to us today. And of course, people being people, they also found clever ways to bend or outright stretch the rules. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, the church required fasting on certain days of the week, particularly Fridays, and on long religious seasons like Lent, Advent, and Ember Days. Altogether, nearly half the year could be classified as fasting days. That didn't necessarily mean people stopped eating altogether. Instead, it meant restrictions. The most important was that meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. That meant no beef, pork, mutton, venison, or poultry. On some days, dairy and eggs were also restricted. For ordinary people who lived on meat only occasionally anyway, this might not seem like a huge shift. But for nobles and wealthy households, it meant serious adjustments. The obvious replacement for meat was fish. Fish was considered acceptable on fasting days because it came from water, not land. That meant rivers, lakes, and seas became crucial food sources, especially during Lent. Salted herring, dried cod, smoked eel, and fresh trout all became staples. Wealthy households went even further, importing expensive fish like sturgeon or lamprey to show off during fasts. Monasteries became major centers of fish production and trade, with ponds and fisheries dedicated to keeping supplies flowing. In fact, fish farming as we know it today has roots in medieval monastic communities. Now, here's where the weirdness comes in. People quickly found loopholes in the fasting rules. For example, Beavers. Yes, beavers. Since beavers lived in water and had tails that resembled fish in both appearance and texture, some church authorities decided their tails could be classified as fish. That meant you could eat beaver tail on a fasting day without breaking the rules. The same logic was applied to other semi-aquatic creatures. In some regions, people argued that puffins, which lived near the sea and could swim, counted as fish too. Even whales and dolphins were sometimes lumped into the fish category, allowing their meat to be eaten during fasts. The rules might have been strict, but the interpretations could get very creative. Another workaround was the invention of substitutes. Since eggs and dairy were often forbidden during Lent, cooks developed alternatives. Almond milk became a common replacement for cow's milk. It was made by grinding almonds into a paste and mixing them with water, producing a white liquid that could be used in cooking. It wasn't cheap, but for wealthy households, it was an elegant way to keep dishes creamy without breaking the fast. Noble cookbooks from the period include dozens of recipes using almond milk for soups, sauces, and even desserts. Similarly, cooks devised pastries and puddings that mimicked dairy-heavy recipes but stayed within the rules. For peasants, fasting days didn't change life as much. Their diets were already heavy on grains, vegetables, and legumes, with little meat to begin with. A Lenten diet of bread, pottage, and fish wasn't much different from their normal routine. Still, fasting could feel burdensome when dairy and eggs were banned, since these were important sources of protein for poorer households. In some cases, peasants quietly ignored the rules, eating what they had. Enforcement varied. In cities and monasteries, fasting was taken seriously, with penalties for breaking it. In remote villages, people sometimes did as they pleased. We should also talk about the psychology of fasting. To medieval Christians, fasting wasn't just about food. It was about controlling the body, disciplining desire, and imitating Christ's suffering. To skip meat or dairy was a sacrifice, a way of proving devotion. Food wasn't just fuel, it was moral. Eating the wrong thing at the wrong time could be seen as a sin, not just a mistake. That added a strange weight to everyday meals. Imagine sitting down to a piece of cheese in March and wondering whether you were breaking God's law. Every bite carried spiritual meaning. But of course, humans being inventive, fasting also created a culture of feasting. Because if nearly half the year was restricted, the other half was filled with celebration. Carnival, the days before Lent, was famous for gluttony, where people stuffed themselves with meat, dairy, and sweets before the long fast began. Feasts after Easter or Christmas broke the restrictions with massive displays of abundance. The contrast between fasting and feasting shaped the rhythm of the entire year. One fascinating detail is how fasting influenced trade. The demand for fish skyrocketed during Lent, creating whole industries around salted and dried fish. Northern Europe relied heavily on stockfish from Norway and Iceland. This was cod dried rock hard, shipped across the continent, and soaked before eating. In England, barrels of salted herring came from the North Sea. These preserved fish became staples of the Lenten table. Even inland monasteries and towns built fish ponds to keep live supplies on hand. Without fasting rules, medieval Europe's fish economy might never have developed so strongly. Another quirk was the development of mock foods. Some cooks prepared dishes that looked like meat but weren't. Recipes survived for things like fish bacon, strips of fish cured and spiced to resemble pork, or vegetable pastes molded into the shapes of animals. These playful dishes let people enjoy the illusion of meat while technically obeying the rules. Wealthy diners especially enjoyed this kind of culinary trickery. It showed off the cook's skill and made fasting days less monotonous. Alcohol, interestingly, was not forbidden. Ale and wine flowed just as freely on fasting days as on feasting days. That meant even when food was restricted, people still had calorie-rich drinks to keep them going. In fact, in some monasteries, the amount of beer consumed during Lent was higher, since it replaced the lost calories from meat and dairy. Of course, not everyone obeyed perfectly. Records show fines for breaking fasts, especially in towns where church authorities kept closer watch. Monks who secretly ate meat during Lent could face harsh penalties. But ordinary people often bent the rules quietly. A fisherman might sneak meat on a Friday. A family might use a little butter in their pottage instead of almond milk. Enforcement was never total. The rules were clear, but daily life was flexible. What makes all of this strange to us is how much meaning was loaded onto food. Today, skipping meat might be a health choice or a personal preference. In the Middle Ages, it was tied to sin, salvation, and community identity. Eating fish wasn't just about taste. It was about obedience. And the workarounds, beaver tails as fish, almond milk as a dairy substitute, mock meats, show how people navigated those rules in practical, sometimes humorous ways. If you were dropped into Lent in a medieval village, your meals would feel repetitive. Pottage without bacon, bread with no butter, maybe a piece of salted herring or dried cod. Ale to drink, of course. If you were in a monastery, you might see inventive almond milk soups, spiced fish pies, or vegetables cooked in vinegar. And if you were in a noble household, you might even be served mock roast shaped from fish or pastries. It would feel odd, even restrictive, but to medieval people, it was just the cycle of life. Fast, feast, fast, feast. The rhythm of the year turned on the rules of the church, and everyone, from peasant to king, lived within that rhythm. So fasting wasn't really about eating less. It was about eating differently, about reshaping daily life to match spiritual ideals. And in doing so, it created a whole system of weird workarounds that remind us how human people always are. Give them a rule, and they'll find a loophole. In the Middle Ages, those loopholes just happened to involve beavers, puffins, almond milk, and salted herring. When you think of medieval food, you probably imagine plain stews, simple bread, maybe roasted meat. But one of the strangest features of medieval cooking, especially among the wealthy, was the taste for mixing flavors that we don't usually combine today. Sweet with savory, fruit with meat, sugar with fish, spices with everything. To the medieval palate, these pairings weren't odd at all, they were luxurious, fashionable, even medicinal. But to us, a beef stew seasoned with raisins and cinnamon might feel confusing, if not downright unpleasant. These odd flavor combinations tell us a lot about how medieval people thought about food, taste, and even health. Let's start with the influence of spices. Imported from Asia and the Middle East, spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and pepper were incredibly expensive. Using them in food wasn't just about taste, it was a status symbol. If you could afford to season your roast beef with cinnamon, everyone at the table knew you had wealth and connections. But spices didn't just appear in sweet dishes the way we use them now. They went into savory dishes too. Chicken might be stewed with ginger and sugar. Fish could be cooked with raisins and almonds. Pork pies sometimes included figs, prunes, or dates. To medieval diners, this mixture of sweet and savory was the height of sophistication. Part of the reason for this comes from medieval medical theory. The idea of the four humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry, shaped how food was combined. If meat was considered heavy and hot, then adding fruit, which was thought to be moist and cooling, helped balance the dish. Spices added warmth, sugar balanced bitterness, vinegar sharpened flavors. Meals weren't just about satisfying hunger. They were about creating harmony in the body. So a stew of beef with raisins and wine wasn't just a strange taste, it was a health practice, at least in theory. Another odd combination was the use of sugar with meat and fish. Today, sugar is almost exclusively for desserts or sweet drinks. But in the Middle Ages, sugar was a luxury imported at great cost, and it was treated more like a spice than a staple. A sprinkling of sugar on roast chicken, or a sauce made of sugar, vinegar, and spices for fish, was considered elegant. It showed off wealth while also producing a surprising sweet and sour flavor. Recipes survive for dishes like pygg in sauce sorge, a pork dish with sugar, vinegar, and herbs. Imagine biting into pork seasoned not with salt and pepper, but with sugar and cinnamon. That was normal for the upper classes. Fruit was another common ingredient in meat dishes. Apples with pork, plums with beef, cherries with venison, pears with fish. These combinations may sound odd, but they were everywhere in medieval cookbooks. Dried fruits, like raisins, prunes, and dates, were especially popular. They were imported goods, so their presence signaled luxury. A noble pie might contain layers of minced meat, suet, and dried fruit all baked together. The result was rich, dense, and very different from the fruit pies we know today. Even savory sauces often included fruit. A common medieval sauce was made of ground raisins, bread crumbs, vinegar, and spices, served over roasted meat. Sweet, sour, spicy, and savory all at once. Nuts also appeared in unexpected places. Almonds, in particular, were used constantly. Almond milk substituted for dairy during fasts, but it also became the base for sauces and stews. Meat dishes might be thickened with ground almonds, giving them a creamy texture. Fish stews might include almonds and sugar together. Wealthy households kept almonds in bulk, and cooks found endless ways to use them. Combined with sugar and fruit, almonds turned savory dishes into something almost dessert-like, yet still considered a main course. Color also mattered. Medieval cooks cared about how food looked as much as how it tasted. They often used spices, fruits, and flowers to dye dishes. Saffron gave a golden yellow. Spinach made sauces green. Blood darkened stews. Sometimes the combination of flavors was less important than the visual effect. A dish might be sweetened heavily just to achieve the right color, or seasoned oddly just to surprise guests. A pie could be made half red with cherries, half yellow with saffron, creating a visual spectacle. The taste was secondary to the impression. One of the most famous odd dishes was blancmange, not the sweet pudding we know today, but a medieval dish of shredded chicken, rice, almond milk, and sugar. It was white, soft, and considered both elegant and medicinal. To modern eaters, chicken with sugar sounds odd, but to medieval diners, it was refined. Similarly, fish dishes often included sugar and wine. A recipe for salmon might call for cinnamon and ginger, turning it into something closer to a dessert sauce. These combinations challenge our modern divisions between savory and sweet. We also find records of spiced wine, called hippocras, which was wine mixed with sugar, cinnamon, ginger, and other spices. It was served at the end of feasts, both as a digestive and as a display of wealth. Guests expected to taste odd, sweet flavors in places we wouldn't put them today. Imagine drinking a cup of warm, sweetened red wine flavored with cloves after a meal of beef and raisins. To us, strange. To them, proper. For peasants, flavor combinations were simpler, but still unusual to us. Onions and leeks went into everything, often combined with whatever grain or bean was available. If a bit of fat or bacon was added, it flavored the entire pot. Occasionally fruits like apples or pears were thrown into pottage, not as a dessert, but as part of the stew. Sourness from apples mixed with cabbage and barley was common. For the poor, food was about stretching what you had, so odd mixtures weren't about luxury, they were about survival. Some of the oddest pairings came at feasts, where cooks tried to outdo themselves with creativity. There are records of peacocks roasted, redressed in their feathers, and sprinkled with sugar. Swans served with sweet sauces. Eels cooked with prunes. Rabbit stewed with cinnamon and ginger. These were showpieces, designed to shock and impress guests. The stranger the combination, the more memorable the feast. Nobles competed not just in wealth but in novelty, and food was part of that competition. Underlying all this was the belief that food influenced mood and character. A dish that combined meat, strong, hot, with fruit, cooling, moist, and spices, warming, wasn't just tasty. It was balancing the body's humors. Sweetness was linked to calmness. Sourness was linked to sharpness. Spice was linked to warmth and vigor. Meals were miniature medicines. So even if the flavors sound odd to us, they carried meaning. To eat beef with raisins wasn't just to eat beef with raisins, it was to harmonize your body, to calm one humor and strengthen another. If you found yourself at a medieval table, the flavors might surprise you. You'd take a bite of chicken and taste sugar and cinnamon. You'd eat fish with raisins and vinegar. You'd sip wine spiced with ginger. At first, it might feel wrong, like dessert and dinner had collided. But over time, you'd adapt. You might even begin to crave those combinations. After all, medieval people grew up on them, and they saw them as the height of refinement. To them, plain roasted meat would have seemed boring, even crude. Flavors needed to be complex, layered, surprising. So these odd flavor combinations weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, rooted in medicine, status, and taste. They remind us that what feels normal or strange in food is always cultural. Our division between savory and sweet didn't exist in the same way then. Food categories were fluid, and taste was shaped by beliefs we no longer share. That's why medieval food, to us, seems weird. To them, it was elegant. When we think of medieval food, it's easy to picture bread and meat, maybe some ale, maybe a pot of stew. But dairy, milk, butter, and cheese played a surprisingly complicated role in the medieval diet. It wasn't straightforward, and it certainly wasn't treated with the same consistency as it is today. For us, dairy feels ordinary. A glass of milk, a pat of butter, a slice of cheese. For medieval people, dairy carried meanings that were social, moral, and even medical. Some trusted it, others distrusted it. It was everyday fuel for peasants, but often treated with suspicion by the upper classes. And because it spoiled so quickly, dairy was one of the most fragile and unpredictable parts of the medieval table. Let's begin with milk itself. Fresh milk was hard to keep. Without refrigeration, it spoiled within hours, especially in summer. That meant it was rarely drunk plain. Peasants sometimes gave children milk straight from the cow or goat, but adults usually avoided drinking it raw. Instead, milk was quickly transformed into other things, butter, cheese, or curds. These lasted longer and could be stored or traded. Still, milk was plentiful in the countryside, where nearly every family kept a cow, a goat, or sheep. For peasants, dairy was a vital part of daily survival. The nobility, however, often looked down on milk. Physicians influenced by the theory of humors considered milk cold and moist. That meant it was thought to weaken the body, encourage phlegm, or even make people dull-minded. Some medical writers recommended it only for children, the elderly, or the sick, people whose humors needed softening. Healthy adults were better off, they argued, avoiding fresh milk. So while peasants drank it and used it freely, nobles sometimes avoided it, or at least preferred it in processed form, like cheese or butter. Butter was another story. In Northern Europe, butter was common and practical. It was used for cooking, spreading on bread, and adding richness to pottage. But again, it was fragile. In warm weather, butter went rancid quickly. Households often stored it in cool cellars or buried it in containers to keep it longer. In monasteries, butter sometimes became controversial during fasting seasons. Since dairy was banned during Lent and certain fast days, butter technically wasn't allowed. In some regions, the church even sold indulgences that permitted butter eating during Lent, creating what we might call a butter tax. This money helped fund church projects, while allowing people to keep their diets familiar. In other words, butter was so essential that people were willing to pay to bend the rules. Cheese was perhaps the most important dairy product. Harder and longer lasting than milk or butter, cheese became a staple across Europe. Peasants made simple, rustic cheeses at home from cows' or goats' milk. These were often sour, crumbly, and eaten fresh, since they didn't keep long. But monasteries became famous for developing harder, aged cheeses that could last for months or even years. These cheeses became trade goods, carried across regions, sold in markets, and stored for lean times. Monastic records describe wheels of cheese being stockpiled as part of a monastery's food supply. For peasants, cheese was daily protein. For nobles, fine cheeses were delicacies. Even so, cheese carried mixed opinions. Some physicians praised it as strengthening, especially hard cheese. Others warned it was difficult to digest and could block the stomach. Soft cheese was sometimes seen as corrupting or dangerous to health. Once again, humoral theory shaped attitudes. Cheese was thought to be cold and dry, good in moderation, but dangerous in excess. To balance it, people ate it with wine or spices, hoping to harmonize the humors. So cheese wasn't just food, it was a medical question. Another curious thing is how dairy was linked to class. In many cultures, milk and butter were seen as peasant food. They were common in the countryside, but nobles often avoided them, preferring meats, breads, and spiced dishes. Rich cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries rarely mentioned butter or milk directly, except in sauces or sweets. When dairy did appear in noble cooking, it was often transformed into something elegant. Almond milk substituted for real milk in fancy recipes, sweet custards flavored with sugar and saffron, or cheesecakes made with honey. By contrast, in peasant huts, a bowl of curds and whey with bread was everyday dinner. Speaking of curds and whey, this was a common dish across medieval Europe. Fresh milk was curdled with rennet or vinegar, separating the curds, solid, from the whey, liquid. The curds were eaten with bread, often with herbs or onions, while the whey might be drunk or used in cooking. This dish was simple, cheap, and quick to make. It appears in records from England, France, and Germany. For peasants, it was filling and nutritious. For nobles, it was sometimes dismissed as coarse fare. Yet even the wealthy might eat curds and whey during fasting seasons, since it was lighter than meat. We should also mention cream. When milk sat, the cream rose to the top, and households skimmed it for special use. Cream was rarer than milk or butter, since it required large quantities of milk and careful handling. In noble kitchens, cream was prized for custards, sauces, and desserts. Combined with sugar and eggs, cream made luxurious puddings and tarts. But for peasants, cream was often out of reach. Their milk went straight into cheese or butter. Only in especially good seasons might they enjoy cream on bread. One of the oddest dairy dilemmas was storage. Without modern preservation, dairy products spoiled quickly. People tolerated flavors we might find unpleasant today. Butter that turned rancid wasn't always thrown away, it was scraped, cooked, or even used medicinally. Cheese that mold might be trimmed and eaten anyway. Sour milk was turned into curds or used in baking. Waste was unthinkable. So the taste of medieval dairy was often stronger, sourer, and less predictable than what we're used to. Imagine butter with a sharp tang, cheese with a crumbly sourness, or milk that had begun to curdle. These were normal. Dairy also connected directly to religion. As mentioned, fasting rules often banned milk, butter, and cheese. That created an entire substitute industry. Almond milk, as we saw earlier, became the go-to replacement. Nobles stocked almonds specifically for this purpose, and cooks devised elaborate almond-based recipes to mimic dairy dishes. Peasants, who couldn't afford almonds, simply went without. So dairy became another marker of class. The rich had substitutes. The poor endured the bans. Trade in dairy also mattered. Certain regions became famous for their cheese, much like today. French monasteries produced varieties that spread across Europe. In England, Cheshire cheese developed a reputation. In Italy, Parmesan emerged as a hard, exportable cheese. These regional cheeses became part of commerce, shipped long distances, feeding armies, monasteries, and towns. Dairy wasn't just local. It was part of a growing economy. We should also consider how dairy was seen culturally. In literature, milkmaids and dairy work often symbolized rustic life. Butter churns, cheese presses, and milk pails were everyday tools in peasant homes. In contrast, nobles almost never appear in stories associated with dairy. It was low food, practical and humble. And yet, it kept millions alive. Bread and cheese became the peasant's daily ration, sometimes with ale. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. If you sat down in a medieval cottage, you might be served coarse bread with a lump of cheese, maybe a bowl of curds and whey, and a cup of ale. The cheese might be sour, the curds lumpy, the butter strong. If you sat at a noble feast, you might not see much dairy at all, unless it was transformed into a custard, a sweet tart, or an almond milk dish pretending to be dairy. That contrast between humble reality and noble avoidance makes dairy one of the strangest medieval food categories. So what's weird about all this? To us, milk, butter, and cheese are staples, unremarkable. To medieval people, they were unstable, suspicious, and morally complicated. Milk was for children or peasants, not adults. Butter was essential but sometimes forbidden. Cheese was nourishing but potentially harmful. Almond milk, not cow's milk, was the luxury. And spoiled flavors were tolerated daily. Dairy in the Middle Ages wasn't simple. It was a dilemma, practical, cultural, and spiritual all at once. If peasants lived on bread, cheese, and endless pots of pottage, and if townsfolk made do with salted fish and ale, the nobility lived in a different world altogether. Their food wasn't only about survival. It wasn't even just about taste. For nobles, food was theater. It was wealth turned into spectacle, abundance put on display, and power made edible. When nobles dined, they didn't simply eat, they performed. And the stranger the performance, the more impressive it was. Meals became shows of status, and dishes themselves became stage props in a kind of edible drama. Let's begin with the medieval banquet. Imagine a great hall, high ceilings, wooden beams, tapestries on the walls, torches burning, music playing. Long tables are set with trenchers of bread, pitchers of ale and wine, and knives ready for carving. Guests gather, not just to eat, but to witness. Servants bustle back and forth. The lord or lady sits at the high table, elevated above the others. When the meal begins, it isn't just about filling stomachs, it's about filling eyes, ears, and noses with the smell, sound, and sight of excess. The centerpiece of these banquets was often meat, but not just ordinary roasts. Entire animals were prepared in ways that highlighted extravagance. Swans roasted whole, their feathers reattached to their bodies after cooking. Peacocks with gilded beaks and bright plumage, presented as though still alive. Boars' heads, carried in with ceremony, garnished with herbs and fruits. These weren't practical dishes. They were spectacles, designed to astonish. Imagine sitting at the table when servants carried in a roasted peacock, shimmering in its iridescent feathers, surrounded by saffron-colored sauce. You weren't just eating, you were participating in a display of wealth so lavish that it bordered on the absurd. Another form of showing off came with what were called ventremets. These were dishes served between courses, often not meant to be eaten at all. Sometimes they were elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like castles, saints, or animals. Other times they were pies that, when cut open, released live birds or frogs, creating a chaotic, surprising moment in the hall. At one feast, records describe a giant pastry that concealed musicians inside, who burst out playing when it was served. Imagine that, you think you're cutting into a pie, and suddenly music fills the air. It sounds almost cartoonish, but for medieval nobles, this was entertainment. Food was also used to tell stories. Entremets might be arranged to represent battles, biblical scenes, or allegories. One feast famously presented a roasted pig dressed as a knight, riding a smaller roasted pig like a horse. Another had dishes dyed in symbolic colors to represent virtues or seasons. Guests weren't just eating, they were consuming symbols, partaking in a narrative carefully arranged by the host. Meals became theater, and theater became a way of showing who had the resources to make it happen. But why go to such lengths? Because in the Middle Ages, wealth wasn't hidden. It was shown. A noble's table wasn't private, it was a public stage where generosity and power were performed. The ability to feed dozens, even hundreds, of people with exotic, strange, and wasteful dishes proved dominance. It said, "I have so much, I can afford to waste it." Serving peacock when peasants outside the castle walls lived on cabbage pottage wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Food reinforced hierarchy. It told everyone in the hall where they stood. Spices played a big role in this display. As we've seen before, spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron were expensive imports. Using them lavishly in meat and fish dishes showed wealth. But nobles didn't stop at flavor. They also used spices to dye food. Saffron turned rice golden. Sandalwood gave a red hue. Spinach or parsley made sauces green. Guests were served dishes in colors they didn't expect, a stew that glowed yellow, a pie that shimmered red, a custard that gleamed green. These colors weren't necessary, but they were impressive. They said, "This dish is so rich in spice, it's more art than food." Sugar, too, became a tool for spectacle. Sugar sculptures, known as subtleties, were carved into intricate designs and placed on the table as decorations. Castles, animals, biblical figures, all sculpted from sugar. They weren't always meant to be eaten, though guests sometimes nibbled at them. The point was the display. Sugar was so costly that building a sugar castle on your table was the medieval equivalent of showing off a diamond necklace. Guests saw it, admired it, and understood its meaning. This host is wealthy enough to serve pure luxury as decoration. Even the sequence of a banquet reflected showing off. A noble feast could have dozens of courses, far more than anyone could realistically eat. Each course brought new dishes, new surprises, new performances. Guests were overwhelmed by abundance. They couldn't possibly finish everything, and that was the point. The waste itself demonstrated wealth. To leave food uneaten proved that the host had plenty. Leftovers were often distributed to servants, poor people at the gate, or neighboring households, but during the feast itself, the excess was part of the show. One particularly odd example is the carcantress, a dish made by sewing together parts of different animals. A piglet's body might be stitched to a capon's upper half, creating a chimera of meat. Sometimes the head of one animal was attached to the body of another. These hybrid creatures were roasted and served as curiosities. They weren't practical, they were conversation pieces, meant to make guests laugh or marvel. Imagine being served a dish that looked like a half-goose, half-pig monster. That was part of the fun. Nobles also flaunted imported goods. Oranges, lemons, figs, dates, almonds, and sugar all came from far away, brought by traders through long, dangerous routes. To serve these foods in abundance showed reach and influence. A noble might serve candied oranges in winter when peasants had nothing but turnips. Guests didn't just taste the fruit, they tasted global trade, wealth, and power condensed into a bite. Of course, not everyone admired this excess. Some medieval writers criticized noble feasts for their wastefulness. Preachers scolded the rich for spending fortunes on sugar sculptures while the poor starved outside. Chroniclers recorded feasts with a tone of awe, but also disapproval, noting the absurdity of live birds flying out of pies while famine stalked the countryside. Still, the practice continued, because for nobles, the banquet wasn't about necessity, it was about image. Even table manners became part of the show. Nobles were expected to eat delicately, using knives and fingers carefully, never appearing greedy. Carving meat was a skilled performance, done by servants who knew exactly how to present slices to the lord and his guests. Drinking from fine goblets, eating from pewter or silver trenchers, wiping hands on embroidered cloths, all of these reinforced the idea of refinement and superiority. For peasants, food was about survival. For nobles, it was about theater. The contrast between noble spectacle and peasant simplicity is what makes this habit so strange. Outside the castle walls, families shared a single pot of barley pottage. Inside, a dozen dishes dyed yellow, red, and green were paraded out with trumpets. For one group, food was survival. For the other, it was performance. That divide defined the medieval world, and nothing showed it more clearly than the noble feast. If you were suddenly transported to a medieval banquet, you might feel overwhelmed. The noise, the smells, the colors, the strangeness of dishes. You'd see swans with feathers, pies with birds, sugar castles, and hybrid animals. You'd taste meat with cinnamon, fish with sugar, custards dyed green. You'd probably find it strange, maybe even unappetizing. But to the people around you, it would be dazzling. They weren't there just to eat. They were there to see, to admire, to remember, and to tell stories about afterward. Food was power on display. So, when we talk about weird medieval food habits, the way nobles showed off at their tables has to be near the top. They weren't just feeding themselves. They were creating edible theater, blending art, wealth, and extravagance into every bite. And while peasants starved on bread and onions, nobles feasted on peacock feathers and sugar castles. Strange to us, but to them, it was the very definition of refinement. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's tempting to think of food purely in terms of survival. People ate what they could get, and they tried to preserve it in whatever way worked. But in truth, medieval people thought about food in ways that went far beyond hunger. To them, food wasn't just fuel for the body. It was tied to medicine, morality, and even personality. What you ate could influence your health, your mood, and even your soul. Some of these beliefs seem strange to us today, because they were based on a medical system that has long since disappeared, the theory of the four humours. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to be the four fluids that governed the body. Health, according to medieval doctors, was a matter of balance between them. Too much blood made you too hot and moist, leading to fevers or passions. Too much black bile made you melancholic. Too much yellow bile made you angry. Too much phlegm made you cold and sluggish. Food, in this system, was a tool to correct imbalances. Everything you ate was categorized as hot or cold, wet or dry. A doctor might prescribe lettuce, considered cold and moist, to calm an overheated temperament. Or he might recommend red meat, thought to be hot and dry, to strengthen a weak body. This meant that meals weren't only about taste. They were about medicine. Eating was a daily act of balancing your body. If you had a fever, you might be told to eat cooling fruits like cucumbers or melons. If you felt sluggish, you might be given warming spices like pepper or ginger. Milk was thought to encourage phlegm, making you drowsy. Cheese could harden inside the stomach, unless balanced with wine. Even bread was divided. White bread was seen as more refined and lighter for the stomach, while dark rye bread was heavier and riskier for digestion. These beliefs extended into moral judgments too. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, so overeating wasn't just unhealthy, it was sinful. Certain foods were linked with virtue, others with vice. Vegetables, being humble and plain, were sometimes seen as good for spiritual discipline. Rich meats, especially heavily spiced, were linked to luxury and excess. A monk eating a bowl of beans was practicing piety. A lord eating peacock in saffron sauce was flaunting vanity. Food carried symbolism at every level. One of the strangest beliefs was that certain foods could stir or suppress desire. Lettuce, for example, was thought to cool passion. Too much lettuce, some writers warned, could make a man lethargic and uninterested in love. On the other hand, meat, wine, and spices were believed to inflame lust. Garlic and onions were also sometimes seen as stimulating. Because of this, monasteries sometimes discouraged or limited spicy or meaty foods, fearing they might lead to temptation. Imagine thinking your supper of roast pork might endanger your soul, not because of gluttony, but because it was thought to stir the wrong desires. Another peculiar belief was that food carried the essence of the animals it came from. Eating lamb might make you gentle and mild. Eating beef might make you strong and stubborn. Eating hare, some thought, could make you timid. Certain fish were believed to encourage fertility, others to weaken it. Food was never neutral. It carried character traits that could be absorbed by the eater. Even plants carried these symbolic qualities. Rosemary was linked to memory. Sage was said to promote wisdom. Because of these ideas, medieval physicians often gave dietary advice as seriously as we take prescriptions today. Manuals survive where doctors lay out what food should be eaten in each season. In winter, when the body was thought to be naturally cold and wet, warming foods like meat, wine, and spices were recommended. In summer, cooling foods like fruits, salads, and light broths were better. Eating the wrong thing at the wrong time of year could unbalance the humors and make you ill. It wasn't about vitamins or calories, it was about harmony between body and season. This thinking even shaped kitchens. Wealthy households often employed a physician alongside cooks, and menus could be designed with humoral theory in mind. A banquet might begin with light, moist foods like fruits or soups, then move to heavier, drier foods like roasted meats, and end with digestive aids like spiced wine or candied ginger. The order of courses wasn't random. It was meant to lead the body through a journey of balance. Another strange habit tied to belief was the use of digestives. Medieval people often ended meals with sugar candies, spiced wine, or herbal infusions. These weren't just desserts. They were thought to settle the stomach, warm the digestion, and prevent imbalances. Spiced wine, called hippocras, was especially popular, made with cinnamon, ginger, and sugar. After a heavy meal of meat and rich sauces, nobles believed it helped the body process everything. In truth, it probably didn't do much, but it made sense in their system. Superstition also crept in. Some people believed that eating certain foods on certain days could bring luck or misfortune. Eggs eaten on Easter symbolized resurrection and renewal. Beans were linked to the souls of the dead in some folk traditions. Garlic was thought to ward off evil spirits as well as illness. Certain foods were avoided altogether because they carried bad associations. For example, some people distrusted mushrooms, believing they grew from decay and carried poison. Others believed strawberries had mystical properties, connected to purity and the Virgin Mary. Then there were fasting beliefs. As we saw earlier, fasting wasn't just about rules, it was about spiritual cleansing. Eating fish instead of meat wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Meat was linked to heat, passion, and sin. Fish was cooler, purer, more disciplined. To eat fish during Lent wasn't only obedience to the church. It was a way of shaping the soul, cooling sinful urges, and preparing for Easter. So beliefs about food reach deep into faith as well as medicine. Some of the most surprising records come from medical texts. One doctor advised that onions should be eaten with moderation, as they heated the blood and might disturb sleep. Another recommended that pregnant women avoid certain fruits to prevent harm to the child. Others believed that almonds improved fertility or that pears were hard to digest and caused illness if eaten too often. These weren't just casual opinions, they were taken seriously, written in Latin, copied in manuscripts, and passed from physician to physician. To us, these ideas feel unscientific, even amusing. We know lettuce doesn't cool passion, that meat doesn't make you lustful, that cheese doesn't block the stomach in a mystical way. But for medieval people, these beliefs shaped daily life. They influenced what people ate, when they ate, and how they thought about their own bodies. A medieval diner didn't just think, "This tastes good." They thought, "This balances my humors," or "This food suits the season," or even, "This dish makes me virtuous." If you were dropped into the Middle Ages and handed a plate of food, you might not just be confused by the flavors. You'd be baffled by the explanations. Someone might tell you that the fish you're eating will cool your temper, or that the lettuce on your trencher will calm your desires, or that the spiced wine at the end of the meal will keep your humors balanced through the night. They would speak with complete confidence, because to them, these ideas were as real as our modern nutrition science. And this is what makes medieval beliefs about food so strange to us. They remind us that food isn't just material, it's cultural. What people believe about what they eat is just as powerful as what they actually eat. For medieval people, food was medicine, morality, and meaning all in one. It was never just food. When you sit down to eat today, you probably don't think much about the tools in front of you. A fork, a spoon, a knife, maybe chopsticks if you're eating something different. But in the Middle Ages, the act of eating looked very different. Utensils, as we know them, were rare. Most people ate with their hands, shared cups and bowls, and used knives in ways that would seem strange to us now. The entire culture of the medieval table reveals how eating wasn't just about food, but about manners, status, and community. And the absence, or rarity, of certain utensils is one of the strangest parts of medieval dining. Let's start with the fork. Today, the fork is an essential tool. But in the Middle Ages, it was almost unheard of in most of Europe. Forks existed in the Byzantine Empire and in parts of the Middle East, and they slowly made their way into Italy by the 11th century. But for centuries, they were seen as unnecessary, even decadent. Why would you need a fork when you had fingers and a knife? In fact, some moralists mocked forks as frivolous, a sign of vanity. Stories even tell of people being criticized for using them, accused of showing off or trying to avoid touching food the way God intended. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages and Renaissance that forks began to spread more widely, and even then, they were slow to catch on. So what did people use? The knife was the primary tool at the table. Every person, especially men, carried a knife with them, often in a sheath on their belt. It wasn't just for eating, it was a tool for daily life. At the table, the knife was used to cut meat, slice bread, and sometimes spear bites of food. In wealthier households, servants might carve large roasts into slices before passing them to guests. But at simpler tables, you cut what you were given, often on a trencher of bread. Knives were personal. You didn't expect the host to hand you one. You brought your own. Spoons also existed, though less commonly than today. Wooden spoons were everyday tools in peasant homes, used for pottage and broth. Metal spoons, made of pewter, bronze, or silver, were rarer and more associated with wealth. A noble guest might bring their own spoon, much as they brought their own knife. Spoons were mainly for liquids, not solids. Thick stews might be eaten with a spoon, but often they were scooped with bread or fingers. For much of daily eating, fingers were the main utensils. People tore bread with their hands, picked up pieces of meat, dipped food into sauces, and ate communally. At a feast, several people might share the same dish. Etiquette manuals from the later Middle Ages give instructions on how to behave. Don't put your whole hand into the serving dish, don't lick your fingers too much, don't wipe your hands on the tablecloth. But fingers were still expected. Eating was a tactile, communal act, not an individual, isolated one. Shared drinking vessels were also normal. A single cup of ale or wine might be passed around the table, each person taking a sip before handing it on. Even nobles sometimes shared goblets with their neighbors, though they might have finer cups of silver or glass. Hygiene, as we think of it, wasn't part of the equation. Sharing was a sign of fellowship. At the same time, there were rules: don't drain the cup completely, don't let your lips linger too long, don't backwash. Medieval etiquette manuals spend surprising detail on these points, because the communal nature of dining required boundaries. Napkins, too, were unusual. In peasant homes, you wiped your hands on whatever was available: your clothes, the table edge, maybe a piece of bread. In noble homes, cloths were provided, but they were shared among guests. A long strip of linen might run down the center of the table, and everyone wiped their hands on it. Sometimes servants brought water bowls to rinse fingers between courses, especially when sauces were messy. But the idea of everyone having a neat, folded napkin of their own was centuries away. One detail that surprises many people is how much of eating was ritualized even without utensils. Carving meat, for example, was a skill. At noble feasts, a carver had to know how to cut a roast in a way that was elegant and proper. It wasn't enough to hack off chunks, you had to slice smoothly, present portions attractively, and serve the Lord first. Manuals even describe the gestures and postures of carving, as though it were a performance. Knives weren't just tools. They were part of a ritual that demonstrated order, refinement, and status. For peasants, things were simpler. Meals were often eaten from a shared bowl, with everyone dipping in using fingers or pieces of bread. In some cases, two people shared a trencher of bread, each eating from their side. This meant meals were intimate. You ate close to others, you shared food, and you accepted the lack of personal space. What seems unhygienic to us was simply the rhythm of life for them. Eating was communal, not private. The absence of forks and the reliance on fingers also shaped the food itself. Many medieval dishes were designed to be eaten by hand. Meat was often roasted on the bone, easy to tear apart. Pies were baked in thick crusts, which acted as containers as well as food. Thick stews could be scooped with bread. Sauces were plentiful, but trenchers soaked them up. Even desserts like candied fruits or wafers were finger foods. The entire cuisine fit the tools available, or rather, the lack of them. Still, by the late Middle Ages, we start to see changes. Forks began to appear in Italy, then spread slowly to France and England. At first, they were two-pronged, used mainly for handling sticky or messy foods like candied fruit. Over time, they became more common, but for centuries they remained unusual. In England, for example, forks weren't widely adopted until the 17th century. That means that for most of medieval Europe, people lived and dined without them. What's strange to us is how normal this all felt to them. Imagine sitting down at a feast, dipping your fingers into sauces, tearing bread, sharing a trencher with your neighbor, sipping from the same cup. Imagine wiping your hands on the communal cloth and watching a servant carve meat with elaborate gestures. To us, it might feel chaotic or messy. To them, it was orderly, governed by rules they understood. The absence of forks wasn't noticed, because they didn't expect them. They didn't think of themselves as primitive. They thought of themselves as proper, according to their own standards. The medieval table, then, was a world of knives, spoons, fingers, and bread. It was communal, tactile, and symbolic. It was governed by etiquette that seems odd to us: don't lick your fingers too much, don't bite into bread before the host, don't drink greedily from the shared cup. But those rules gave shape to meals in a world where utensils were few. So when we talk about weird medieval food habits, the absence of utensils is one of the most striking. No forks, shared cups, knives as personal possessions, spoons as occasional luxuries. Eating was messy, communal, and full of rules that don't make sense to us now. But for them, it was completely natural. Food wasn't just about flavor, it was about the way you held it, shared it, and experienced it together. One of the strangest aspects of medieval food culture wasn't just what people ate or how they ate it, but the rhythm between abundance and scarcity. Life in the Middle Ages was shaped by cycles of plenty and hunger, feasting and famine. For nobles, that meant weeks of extravagant banquets, where tables groaned under mountains of meat and spiced wine. For peasants, it often meant periods of near starvation, where the pot of pottage grew thinner and thinner until it was little more than warm water with a few wilted greens floating in it. The contrast was brutal, but it was normal. Medieval people accepted that food came in waves, and those waves defined the pace of their lives. Let's start with the feast. For nobles and the wealthy, feasts weren't occasional treats. They were regular events tied to the calendar: Christmas, Easter, weddings, harvest celebrations, military victories, or visits from important guests. These weren't modest affairs. A noble feast could last for days, with dozens of courses, hundreds of dishes, and entertainment in between. A feast wasn't just eating, it was a performance, a public display of power and wealth. Whole animals roasted, pies bursting with birds, sugar sculptures, colored stews, and spiced wines all announced that the host was prosperous enough to waste food and entertain lavishly. The feast was theater, and food was its stage. The food itself reflected abundance. A noble banquet might include roasted venison, swan, peacock, goose, chicken, beef, pork, and rabbit, all in a single evening. Each course would be flavored with expensive spices like cinnamon, ginger, and saffron. Fruits imported from the south, figs, dates, oranges, or almonds, added exotic touches. Desserts of candied fruit, custards, and wafers followed, with sweet wine or hippocras poured freely. Guests couldn't possibly eat it all, but that wasn't the point. The point was the excess, the spectacle of plenty. Waste itself became a marker of status. For peasants, feasts were far rarer. A village might hold a communal celebration at harvest time, or after a wedding, or for a major religious festival. These feasts were simpler, but no less important for the community. A slaughtered pig roasted on a spit, shared among many families. Ale brewed in larger quantities. Bread made in big batches. Pottage made richer for the occasion, with meat and herbs added instead of just vegetables and grain. For a poor family, these moments of abundance stood out in memory: a day when the pot was full, the bread fresh, and the ale flowing. They were breaks in the rhythm of scarcity, small holidays from hunger. But the other side of the cycle was famine. In a world without modern agriculture, refrigeration, or global trade, food supplies were fragile. A bad harvest could mean hunger for an entire village. A wet summer could rot crops in the fields. A harsh winter could kill livestock. And when stores ran out before the next harvest, people entered what was sometimes called the hungry gap, the months of late winter and early spring when the old stores were nearly gone, but the new crops hadn't yet come in. This was one of the hardest parts of the medieval year. Families stretched what they had, eating dried peas, old beans, hard bread, or whatever wild plants they could forage. Pottage became thinner, stretched with cabbage leaves or weeds. In extreme cases, famine could devastate entire regions. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst. Heavy rains ruined harvests, grain rotted in the fields, and livestock disease killed herds. Chroniclers describe people eating cats, dogs, and even grass to survive. Some even whispered about cannibalism. Tens of thousands died, and even nobles felt the pinch, though they suffered less than peasants. Famines like this revealed the fragility of medieval food systems. A single bad season could bring misery to millions. Even in ordinary years, the contrast between feast and famine was stark. A noble household might slaughter dozens of animals for a feast while peasants outside struggled to find enough bread. Some nobles did provide charity, distributing leftovers or giving alms, but the inequality was obvious. To sit in a hall with roasted peacocks while peasants starved outside was normal, even expected. Food wasn't just nutrition. It was power and hierarchy on display. The feast-famine rhythm also shaped religious life. Feasting days alternated with fasting days. Lent followed Carnival. A day of abundant meat might be followed by a day of fish and bread. The cycle was moral as well as practical. Feasting celebrated life, community, and God's blessings. Fasting reminded people of discipline, humility, and dependence. Together, they gave the year a rhythm that balanced indulgence with restraint. What's strange to us is how medieval people accepted hunger as part of life. Today, famine feels like an emergency, a disaster. In the Middle Ages, it was a recurring threat, woven into the seasons. People expected scarcity in certain months. They expected hunger when harvests failed. They prayed for abundance, but they lived with famine. And when abundance came, they celebrated with feasts so lavish that they seemed to mock the hunger that had come before. Food preservation methods helped, of course, but they couldn't erase the cycle. Salted meat, smoked fish, dried peas, these kept people alive, but they weren't enough in bad years. When stocks ran low, people turned to desperate measures, grinding acorns into meal, eating tree bark, boiling nettles. Chroniclers record entire communities reduced to foraging, while nobles still dined on stored salted beef and imported wine. The gap between feast and famine was social as well as seasonal. Another layer was symbolism. Feasts weren't just about eating well. They were about celebrating survival after famine. A harvest feast wasn't only joy at abundance, it was relief that the village had made it through the hungry months. The very act of roasting a whole animal and sharing it was a declaration, we survived. We have food again. The memory of hunger made abundance more meaningful. We also have to remember that feasts could tip into waste. Chronicles describe nobles ordering more food than anyone could eat, letting dishes go untouched, or feeding leftovers to dogs rather than the poor. Some writers criticized this as immoral. Preachers scolded nobles for their gluttony while peasants starved. But the practice continued, because in the medieval mindset, feasting was tied to honor and prestige. A noble who hosted a meager feast was shamed. Better to waste food than to appear poor. The cycle of feast and famine also influenced cooking itself. Noble dishes were rich in spices, sugar, and imported fruits precisely because they marked abundance. Peasant dishes were simple, made of whatever survived scarcity: grains, beans, cabbage, onions. The flavors of each class reflected their relationship to abundance. For peasants, food was survival. For nobles, food was excess. Imagine yourself dropped into this world. In one moment, you're sitting in a smoky cottage in February, eating a thin bowl of barley pottage with nothing but a few wilted greens. The children are hungry, the stores are nearly gone, and spring feels far away. A few weeks later, if you're lucky enough to be at a noble feast, you're overwhelmed by the smell of roasted venison, swans in their feathers, pies bursting with spices, sugar sculptures gleaming on the table. Two realities side by side: hunger and excess, famine and feast. Both were normal, both were part of the medieval rhythm. So when we talk about weird medieval food habits, perhaps nothing is stranger than this cycle. The same society that starved through winters celebrated abundance with grotesque feasts. The same world that boiled acorns into porridge also paraded out peacocks in gold-dyed feathers. To us, it feels contradictory. To them, it was life. Feast and famine weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same coin, the rhythm of survival in the Middle Ages. When we picture medieval eating, we often think of peasants huddled in cottages around a pot of pottage, or nobles dining in grand halls with peacocks and sugar castles. But there was another important part of food culture that lived between those two extremes: the streets and taverns. Towns and cities across medieval Europe had their own food economies, full of street vendors, alehouses, inns, and taverns where ordinary people could grab a bite to eat or drink. If you walked through a medieval marketplace, the smell of hot pies, frying fish, and freshly baked bread would greet you long before you reached the stalls. Street food and taverns might not seem glamorous, but they reveal a whole other side of medieval food habits, one that feels strangely modern, yet also very different from what we're used to. Let's start with street food. In growing towns and cities, not everyone had time, space, or equipment to cook at home. Fires were dangerous, wood was expensive, and ovens were often communal. For workers, apprentices, and travelers, buying ready-made food was easier. Vendors set up stalls or walked the streets selling simple, cheap meals. Pies were especially popular, small meat or fish pies that could be carried and eaten by hand. Imagine a laborer buying a hot pie on his way to work, much like someone today grabbing a sandwich or a slice of pizza. These pies weren't luxurious, but they were filling, often made with minced meat, fish, or even vegetables stretched with fat and spices. Fish was another common street food. Fried or roasted, sold in pieces wrapped in leaves or placed on bread, it was affordable and portable. Pancakes, fritters, and little cakes made from grain or beans were also sold, sometimes sweetened with honey if the buyer could pay more. In larger towns, vendors competed for customers, shouting their wares, advertising freshness or price. A medieval marketplace could be noisy, smoky, and full of food smells. It wasn't sterile, and it certainly wasn't hygienic by modern standards. But it was lively and accessible. Bread was central, too. Bakers sold fresh loaves daily, and while wealthier people might bake at home or send their dough to a communal oven, many simply bought bread from stalls. Bread was not uniform. White wheat bread was expensive, eaten by the rich, while darker rye or barley loaves were cheaper, eaten by the poor. A worker might buy a hunk of dark bread and a piece of cheese to eat on the go. Vendors sold bread in different grades, and customers knew what their money could buy. Alehouses and taverns extended this culture. Taverns were more than drinking places, they were centers of community life. A tavern served ale, wine if available, and simple hot foods like stews, pies, and roasted meat. For townsfolk, this was often easier than cooking at home. For travelers, inns and taverns were essential stops. Imagine arriving in a strange town after a long day's walk, tired and hungry. The tavern was where you found food, drink, warmth, and company. Taverns had reputations, though. Some were respectable, serving merchants, craftsmen, and travelers. Others were rowdier, known for gambling, fighting, and disorder. Preachers often warned against spending too much time in taverns, accusing them of corrupting morals and draining wallets. Court records confirm their concerns. Many brawls, thefts, and even murders took place in alehouses. Yet despite their reputation, taverns were everywhere. People went there not just for food, but for news, business, and socializing. The food in taverns was plain but hearty. A pot of pottage simmering over the fire, available by the bowl. Bread and cheese, cheap and filling. Roasted meat, sold in portions. Fish stews in coastal towns, sausages in German regions, wine and olives in southern Europe. The menu varied, but the idea was the same: simple meals to go with drink. Ale flowed constantly, and wine was imported in southern regions or among the wealthy. Drinking and eating were inseparable. A tavern was as much about the mug in your hand as the food on your plate. For poorer workers, taverns were also important because of credit. People didn't always pay in cash on the spot. A tavern keeper might allow a regular to run a tab, recorded in a chalk mark or a notebook. This created a sense of loyalty, but also debt. Many workers found themselves bound to taverns not just by habit, but by obligation. If you owed the tavern keeper, you kept coming back, spending what little you had on ale and stew, trying to balance the books. Street food and taverns also reveal the class divides in medieval society. Nobles almost never ate in taverns, unless traveling in disguise. Taverns were for commoners, townsfolk, and sometimes clergy who slipped away from monasteries. For the wealthy, street food was beneath them. For the poor, it was survival. Street pies, roasted fish, and bowls of pottage were fast, cheap, and filling. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. Another interesting detail is how regulation shaped these foods. Town authorities often passed laws about bread prices, ale measures, and food quality. Bakers could be fined for short-weight loaves. Alewives were punished for watering down ale. Vendors were sometimes accused of selling rotten fish or spoiled meat. Markets had inspectors who checked weights and measures, trying to prevent fraud. Of course, fraud still happened, but the very existence of regulation shows how important street food was to the urban population. Without it, workers and the poor would have gone hungry. Seasonality shaped the menu, too. In winter, vendors sold hot stews and pies. In summer, they offered more fresh bread, cheese, and fruits. On fasting days, taverns served fish instead of meat. During Lent, fish pies, eel stews, and almond milk pottages became common. Taverns adapted to the religious calendar, knowing that customers expected fasting foods on certain days. Business followed not just hunger, but the church's rules. We also shouldn't forget the role of women. Many street vendors were women, especially those selling pies, bread, dairy, or cooked fish. Alewives brewed and sold ale from their homes, turning them into informal taverns. These women often supported households with their small food trades, though they sometimes faced suspicion. Alewives in particular were stereotyped in literature as dishonest, watering down ale or cheating customers. But in reality, they were central to the food economy. Without them, many communities would have struggled to feed themselves. To modern eyes, street food and taverns might look unsanitary. Food was cooked in smoky, dirty environments. Hands touched everything. Meat wasn't always fresh, and spoiled food was sometimes disguised with heavy spices. Cups were shared. Tables weren't wiped. But medieval people tolerated this. Their standards of hygiene were different. If the food was hot, filling, and cheap, it was good enough. Imagine walking through a medieval town. The air is smoky, the streets narrow and muddy. Vendors call out, hot pies, fresh bread, fried fish. You hand over a few pennies and get a warm meat pie, its crust thick and chewy, the filling salty and rich. You eat it standing, wiping your hands on your tunic. Later, you step into a tavern. It's dark, noisy, filled with the smell of ale and sweat. You sit at a rough wooden bench, share a bowl of pottage with a stranger, and drink from a shared cup of ale. It's not glamorous, but it's communal, lively, and part of daily life. So when we think about weird medieval food habits, we shouldn't just imagine feasts or famine. We should picture the bustling marketplace, the smoky tavern, the pie vendor on the corner. This was food culture for ordinary people, messy, noisy, practical, and full of strange contrasts. Street food and taverns were where hunger met convenience, where community met chaos, and where medieval people lived much of their daily lives. When you think of dessert today, you might imagine chocolate cake, ice cream, or pastries filled with cream. But in the Middle Ages, dessert was a very different thing. For most people, there was no neat sweet course at the end of a meal. Sweetness itself was rare, expensive, and deeply tied to class. Sugar was an imported luxury, honey was the common substitute, and fruit, fresh, dried, or preserved, played a much larger role in sweet dishes than anything we'd recognize as cake or pudding. To us, medieval desserts feel strange, simple in some ways and extravagant in others, shaped as much by trade and religion as by taste. Let's start with sugar. In medieval Europe, sugar wasn't the everyday staple we know today. It was a spice, imported from the Middle East and later from Mediterranean plantations. It was rare, costly, and used sparingly. Only the wealthy could afford it regularly, and when they did, they used it to show off. Nobles sprinkled sugar into meat dishes, sauces, and wines, but they also used it to create what we'd call desserts. Candied fruits, sugar-coated almonds, and even sculptures made entirely of sugar, called subtleties, appeared at the tables of kings and lords. A sugar castle placed on a banquet table wasn't just decoration. It was a statement: we have access to the rarest luxury in the world, and we can waste it on art. Honey was the sweetener of the common people. Peasants didn't have sugar, but they could gather honey from hives or wild bees. Honey sweetened porridge, pottage, and bread. It was also used to preserve fruits, making rudimentary jams or candied fruits. Honey cakes and honey-spiced breads were occasional treats. For villagers, the taste of honey was as close to dessert as most ever came. Honey was also tied to drink. Mead, fermented honey mixed with water, was both a beverage and, in some ways, a sweet treat in itself. Fruit filled much of the gap. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, and berries were eaten fresh when in season. But fruit spoiled quickly, so drying and preserving were essential. Dried raisins, figs, prunes, and dates were imported goods that became common in noble kitchens. These were mixed into pies, tarts, and puddings, often alongside meat. To us, it's odd to find raisins in a meat pie, but to medieval cooks, the mixture of sweet and savory was normal. Fruit also went into sauces, creating the sweet-sour combinations that were fashionable in noble cooking. Almonds became another cornerstone of medieval sweets. Ground into almond milk, they provided a creamy base for custards, puddings, and sauces, especially during fasting seasons when dairy was banned. Almond milk mixed with sugar and rice made blancmange, a dish we might think of as dessert but which was sometimes served as a main course. Almonds were also candied, creating sweet little confections that nobles loved. Again, almonds were expensive, so these sweets carried social weight. Spices added to the sense of luxury. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, all rare imports, flavored sweet dishes. Custards might be spiced with saffron for golden color, wafers flavored with cinnamon, cakes dusted with ginger. Spiced wine, hippocras, was often served at the end of a noble feast as both a digestive and a sweet treat. Imagine sipping a warm, sweet, spiced wine after a heavy meal. It wasn't ice cream, but it was how medieval nobles ended dinner. One of the strangest medieval desserts was the wafer. Thin, crisp cakes made from flour, sugar, and spices, wafers were popular after feasts. They weren't thick or creamy, but they were sweet, portable, and easy to make. Often they were served with spiced wine. For nobles, wafers were part of the ritual of closing a meal, a symbolic gesture that digestion was complete. For peasants, something similar might be a flat cake sweetened with honey or fruit, eaten rarely and with great pleasure. Custards and puddings also appeared. Made with eggs, milk or almond milk, sugar, and sometimes fruit, these dishes were closer to what we'd call dessert. Some were baked in pastry shells, creating early versions of pies. Others were thick, spoonable custards flavored with saffron or cinnamon. But again, these were for the wealthy. Eggs, milk, sugar, and spices were expensive. Peasants might only see custards at major festivals, if at all. There were also the dragées, small sugared seeds, nuts, or spices served at the end of a meal to freshen breath and aid digestion. Anise seeds, fennel, or caraway dipped in sugar became little confections that doubled as medicine. In fact, the line between dessert and medicine was blurry. Sweetness was thought to aid digestion, warm the stomach, and balance the humors. A candied almond wasn't just a treat. It was a health aid, at least in theory. Preserved fruits were another common dessert for nobles. Oranges, lemons, or even melons preserved in sugar syrup were imported delicacies. These candied fruits were glossy, colorful, and rare. To serve them at the end of a banquet was to show off wealth and connections. Guests admired not only the taste but the fact that such fruits had traveled hundreds of miles to reach the table. For peasants, preserved fruit meant apples dried in the sun, prunes strung on cords, or pears stored in cellars. They were simple, practical, and not luxurious, but they offered a bit of sweetness in the dead of winter. Festivals were often the best time for desserts to appear. At Christmas or Easter, even peasants might enjoy honey cakes, spiced bread, or fruit puddings. Towns sometimes distributed sweet treats at fairs, a gingerbread, candied nuts, or fritters fried in oil and sweetened with honey. For children especially, these must have been magical moments, rare bursts of sweetness in otherwise plain diets. The noble obsession with dessert sometimes bordered on the theatrical. Sugar subtleties could be sculpted into animals, castles, or biblical scenes. Guests might marvel at a sugar knight on horseback, glittering in candlelight. These weren't really eaten. They were admired, then discarded. The point was not the taste, but the spectacle. Dessert, in this sense, was art made edible. If you sat at a medieval noble's table, the dessert course might feel confusing. You'd be handed wafers, spiced wine, candied fruit, and small dragées. Perhaps a custard flavored with saffron, or a pie filled with dried fruit and almonds. You might sip sweetened hippocras, flavored with ginger and cinnamon. To your palate, it would feel more like a mix of snacks, drinks, and medicine than a clear dessert course. And yet, this was how meals ended: sweetness as closure, sweetness as status, sweetness as health. For peasants, dessert was more about chance than structure. A bit of honey if the hive produced well. A few dried apples in winter. A rare fritter at a festival. Dessert wasn't an expected part of the meal. It was a gift when it came, a small moment of joy in a diet dominated by bread, pottage, and ale. So what's strange about medieval desserts? Partly their rarity. Sweetness wasn't daily, it was occasional. Partly their form, they weren't cakes or puddings in our sense, but wafers, candied fruits, and spiced wines. And partly their meaning. Dessert wasn't just pleasure. It was medicine, ritual, and status symbol. A candied almond might be as much about digestion as enjoyment. A sugar sculpture might be as much about wealth as taste. Sweetness carried weight far beyond flavor. If you were dropped into a medieval feast, the dessert course would surprise you. No chocolate cake, no pies dripping with cream. Instead, wafers, spiced wine, candied fruit, sugared nuts, custards with saffron. It would feel light, strange, and yet somehow satisfying. You'd realize dessert wasn't an indulgent extra, but an essential ritual: sweetness to end the meal, sweetness to balance the humors, sweetness to prove wealth. And that's what makes medieval desserts so weird to us. They weren't really desserts in our sense. They were part medicine, part luxury, part performance. Sweetness was rare, treasured, and symbolic. It wasn't about everyday pleasure. It was about ending the meal with meaning.